Hey everybody, I wanted to show you today how to make this nice looking ciabatta bread. It's a really nice and easy bread to make. It doesn't require a lot of fancy ingredients. Flour, water, yeast, and salt. That's it. It doesn't require a lot of fancy equipment, a mixer, and that's about all you really need, a baking sheet. But the best thing about it is it doesn't really take a lot of time to do it either. That's not to say that it's going to be done quickly, because it does require a lot of rest time, but it doesn't require a lot of hands-on active time. So keep watching and I'll tell you just how to make it. This recipe you actually have to make in two parts. So the first part I did last night, and let me show you what I did. Super easy. You just take 1 cup of flour, half a teaspoon of dry yeast. It can be instant yeast or dry active yeast. Either way, it works fine. And half a cup of water. You put it all in the bowl, you mix it up until it's thoroughly combined, you cover it up, and you let it sit at room temperature for 8 to 12 hours. So I did this last night right before I went to bed so that this morning I could start working with it. So let's take the lid off and see what we've got here. Yeah, this is what you want, something that looks like this. You could see that yeast has done some work. We've got some bubbles going in there, but it's kind of gloppy looking, which is just right. This is going to be the starter for our bread that we're making today. So this is the first ingredient you're going to need to start off on actual baking day. So once again, this was 1 cup of flour, half a teaspoon of yeast, and half a cup of water. Is that right? Yes. Okay, so the rest of the ingredients you're going to need for today: 3 cups of flour, 1 1/4 cups of water, 1 teaspoon of dry yeast, and 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt. Okay, let's start getting this together. I'm going to be using a mixer today with a dough hook attachment. You're also going to want to have a baking sheet, something like this. You're going to want some plastic wrap, and if you have any large lids, those could come really in handy. Like something tall and maybe squared off, like the lid for a cake carrier or something like that. If you don't have that, you can use plastic bins and just use the bottom part and flip it over. Just, make sure you clean them well first. And if you don't have any of those things, that's cool. You could just use plastic wrap and that'll work for you too. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is not this. We're going to take our flour and our yeast, dump it in there, and our salt, dump that in there too, and give this all a good stir and mix it all up. We just want this all to be combined and thoroughly distributed. And that way we don't have to worry about when to add what later. We just start adding this. And we know all the ingredients are in there. Okay. That's pretty good. So next we are going to add our starter to our mixing bowl. If you have extra hands in the kitchen for this, it can be helpful, because if you've got it in a big bowl like this, sometimes it's a little tricky to hold on to. And just try to get as much of it out of that bowl as you can. Scrape the rest out. You know, the fewer ingredients you leave behind in a bowl, the more bread you have at the end of the day. So, all good. Okay, and then we're going to add to this all of our water. By the way, if this is the first thing you're baking with me, and you haven't had a lot of experience measuring flour, you might want to check out my scones recipe right at the beginning, where I'm talking about how to measure flour. It does give you a couple good tips there to make sure that you have the measurement correct, especially since we tend to measure by volume instead of by weight. It helps you make sure that you're actually getting the amount of flour that you think you're getting. Okay, let's pop this right onto our mixer and attach our dough hook. And we're just going to mix this until it is combined. Which doesn't take very long. I mean, that starter is already so wet. And we are just making it super wet and getting it ready to add all these dry ingredients to it. So you'll see as you do this, it starts getting a little bit foamy in there, and that's what you want. Okay, shut that off. And now we're going to add our flour mixture. And usually when I'm adding a flour mixture like this, I add a little bit of at a time and incorporate it and then add a little bit more. But you know, this time we're going for it. We're just gonna add it all at once. This is kind of a crazy recipe for a bread dough, but it really helps to create that final result you're looking for with a ciabatta, which is that very kind of aerated loaf. And then get it all in there however it works for you and the machine and the container that you're using. Okay. Now we're going to start this slowly, because otherwise it's like flour everywhere, which is a dynamic effect for video, but it's probably not something you want in your kitchen. And you're just gonna leave this at a low speed until everything is incorporated. If you see you've got some dry flour mixture up higher on the sides of the bowl that's not really getting incorporated into the rest of it, just stop your mixture or your mixer, grab a spatula, and just kind of force it down into where that dough is already coming together. Just go all the way around the side. And let it go again. Great, so it looks like it's come together completely at this point. So now I'm just going to turn this up to like a medium speed. Be careful when you've got your mixer here. I've got mine at probably 6. Yes, 6, which is the speed that I'm looking for here. It's kind of medium, but not like crazy whipping around high. Depending on your mixer might start to move around on the counter as you do this. So you might just need to stay and hold it because you don't want it to walk right off of your counter. I'm going to let this go at this speed for about 5 minutes. 5 minutes. And You don't need to sit here and watch me this whole time, so I'll see you in 5. After those 5 minutes are up, it's time to crank up the speed a little bit. I haven't taken it all the way to max speed, but one notch down from that. So on my mixer, that is a speed 8. And you are going to let this go anywhere from like 6 to 10 minutes. And here's what you're looking for. Right now, it's probably still looking like a soupy mess. And to be honest, it's a very wet dough, so it will continue to do that. But as it's spinning, you're going to want to look at it like every once in a while and see what it looks like. Once you see that it's starting to pull some of that dough off that's clinging to the sides and it's kind of trying to pull it into the middle, and you're getting a mound kind of accumulating around that dough hook, that's when you know you're done. And you're gonna hear kind of a slapping sound. Like up to now, you probably just hear the mixer running because there's nothing in there fighting it. And when you get to the right point, you'll hear like that dough is making like slapping sounds inside that bowl. Then you'll know you're done. So anywhere 6 to 10 minutes probably, depending on the strength of your mixer and just the details about your ingredients, how wet or dry they are, and other factors, other environmental factors in your house. So let's see, I am just about there. Do you hear that sound? Slop, 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 slop. That's what we were looking for. Okay, when you hear that and you see it's pulling off, that's when we are going to take this out of the mixer. Uh-oh, it helps to put the bowl down first. And you'll notice it settles back down pretty quickly. It's not going to stay in a big ball because this dough is just really wet. So what you're going to do is scrape whatever dough you can off of that hook. And also off the sides of this bowl, just kind of push it all down into the bottom. If there's anything still on the sides, there shouldn't be too much. And it's going to be wet and sticky and look like this. So you're going to take a piece of plastic wrap, if you have a lid for this, go ahead and put a lid on it. And we're just going to let that sit at room temperature for an hour and then come back and keep going. Okay, it's been sitting for an hour. Let's uncover it and see what's happening. As you can see, it has risen a little bit, so that's great news, but look how soft it is. It will pour out of here if I keep holding it like this. That's okay. This is what you want for this kind of bread, but it means we're gonna have to work with it really, really gently because we're working hard to get all those bubbles worked into there, and we don't want to just crush them all out. But we also want to form it into some sort of a loaf. So the first thing we're going to do, we can use that a little bit later, is pour some flour onto our work surface. Because this is not just a wet dough, but it is going to be kind of sticky, and we don't want it to stick. You get flour on your work surface and also on your hands. Then we're going to, with the assistance of a spatula, put all of this dough right here onto our counter or whatever work surface you're using. You know, you could use just like a large wooden cutting board. Plastic is a little tougher because it does tend to be a little more sticky, but you can still do it. You just might need to use a little more flour to prevent the stick. Okay, that's all set. Ooh, see what I mean? Super sticky. So we're going to Dust some extra flour here on top so we can handle it a little bit better. And if you have the flour stuck on your hands, or dough stuck on your hands, you could just put a little flour on there and roll it, and it should come off. Okay. And as you see, no matter what you do here, you're still going to get some sticking, and you know, it's okay. It's the nature of this dough. And if you have to add a little more flour, that's fine. You know, I always like to put it, you know, off to the side, and I could use it as I need it, because I don't want to have to add more flour than is necessary. So you can see we've knocked a little bit of the air out of this, but we haven't totally smashed it down. So now I'm going to take a piece of my parchment and I'm going to create one loaf on this piece of parchment paper. This dough is going to actually make two. So I'm going to cut this in half and place one into a loaf type shape and place it on this parchment. Roll out the parchment, or cut off the parchment, and dust it with some flour. Okay, take your knife and cut your dough about in half. And the easiest way to pick this up is to kind of get your hands underneath it and work some of that flour underneath it, and then you could just lift it. And when you get it onto this parchment, this is where you can start shaping it. And you're going to want to shape it into a long rectangle form. What's the beauty of ciabatta is it's a really rustic bread, so you don't have to worry about it looking perfect or squared off or anything. It's just the way this is just the way it is. So here I've got one loaf on this piece of parchment. So you can just do 2 loaves like this if that's what you're going for. And if you just want to have loaves, sometimes it's nice to have something that's more of a ciabatta roll, because then you get a bigger crust to interior ratio. And you know, if you really are a big fan of more of that firmer crust, then you might want to make rolls instead of just a loaf. So here's how you do that. So with the other half of this, you're going to cut this into 4. Don't forget, this flour is your friend for keeping these things from getting too sticky. Okay, so I've got 4 sections cut here. This is not going to be a precise science either. And we will get these each onto this other piece of parchment and work this into a square-ish shape. You can even pat it down to kind of get it to be more square. Now, I mean, these are going to be pretty big rolls, cutting these into 4. You could always do smaller. But this dough, you'll notice, it's not the easiest to work with. I mean, it's not really difficult to do, but it's a little bit messy and a little bit sticky. Okay. So of course, if you want tiny rolls, you could do that. You could cut these as small as you like, but I think this is good. So what you're going to want to do now is cover this up and let this rise again at room temperature for 1 to 2 hours. What you want to see is for it to really puff up and get larger. Okay, and we'll look at it again before we put it into the oven. And you're going to want to cover it up, but the way you cover it up, you could cover it up with some cling wrap or plastic wrap and just keep it loosely covered. If you have a really large bowl, maybe you could put that over the top. If you have a lid for like a cake carrier, you could put that over the top, and this is what I'm going to use. Or if you have a large plastic storage bin, you can just use that too. So I'm going to put this loaf right next to the rolls and then put the lid right over the top of everything. You want to make sure though, I'm going to rip off this extra parchment that's on the edges here, so the edge of the lid doesn't press that down onto the dough. So it's okay to have this sticking up in between, because that'll just let the dough rise up in between them. But you want the edge of your lid to come all the way straight down to the countertop without having something that's going to smush that dough inside. All right, well that's it for this part. Let it sit 1 to 2 hours and then we'll check it and bake it. Okay, these have been rising an hour and a half. I have preheated my oven to 425 and it's been at 425 for a good 5 or 10 minutes right now. You don't want it to just get there before you put your stuff in, because once you open the door you lose a lot of that heat and it's not going to be as warm for the first few minutes of baking as it would be otherwise. In fact, you could even crank it up a little bit higher before you put your bread into the oven, and then after you put it in, lower it down to 425, and then you're sure you're going to get a really nice hot oven to start baking your bread right off. Another thing you're going to want to do with this bread is before you put it in, if you have a misting bottle or a spray bottle that you have not used for anything other than water, you could use that to spritz the top of these loaves and it creates like a nicer, crispier crust on there. If you don't have that and you still want to create that effect, you can take a small baking dish or even like a wider flat one and put a lot of water in here, but not so much so you'll spill it, and put that in the oven on the rack underneath the rack where you will have your baking tray. What you can try to do if you've got the space in your oven is put it off to the side a little bit, because you don't want to steam the bottom of your sheet pan. You want that to come around to the top and steam the top of your loaves. So you could always put that in the oven as well. Okay, so let's see how these look. Oops, kind of squished it a little bit. Okay. So the reason we had this on parchment is because this dough is so sticky, we can now just slide it on to our baking sheet without having to try to pick it up and move it again. So I'm going to put my loaf on one sheet and my rolls on another sheet. If you are doing 2 loaves, that's way easier. You can just put them side by side on the one sheet and you're good. We're gonna leave that in the oven 20 to 30 minutes. Probably the rolls will be closer to 20 because they've got, obviously they're smaller, and the loaf will be more like 30. And I will set my timer for 20 minutes and check everything. Take these out if they look ready and let this one keep going. Okay, we're finally out of the oven. My rolls ended up being in there 20 minutes as predicted, but this one I took out after 25, not 30, because it was looking and sounding pretty done to me at that time. So, as you see, the ciabatta ends up being a relatively flat bread. It's because it's so wet, right? It's too heavy to kind of lift up. But that's why you want all those air bubbles in there from all that yeast. And you'll see the difference on these rolls. I just put them in the oven with the tray of steam underneath it. So the crust, or the crust is a little bit crunchy, but still quite pale. On the loaf, I actually spritzed it with some water, which makes it a little more crunchy and obviously a more golden color. So let's cut this open and see what's going on inside. Nice crispy sounding exterior. Ooh. And nice airy pockets on the interior. Can you see that? Anyway, I am going to make myself a delicious snack with some of this. And, you know, this bread is great for all kinds of things. It makes a really nice sandwich if you like a nice crusty bread on your sandwich. You could use it to make garlic bread. I like to use it to make my absolutely favorite breakfast sandwich. Please let me know how it works out for you, and have a great day.